In the year 410, a city that had not fallen to a foreign enemy in nearly 800 years watched its gates open to a Gothic king. For 8 centuries, the word Rome had meant permanence. Empires rose around it and crumbled into dust. Yet Rome endured, expanded, and absorbed the world. Senators believed their city was eternal. Soldiers believed their legions were invincible. Citizens believed the Roman peace would never end. But somewhere between the founding of a small village on the banks of the Tiber and the final collapse of an empire that once stretched from the fog of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia, something began to crack. It did not happen in a single day, nor with a single battle. It happened slowly, in the erosion of institutions, in the corruption of power, in the slow bleeding of borders that could no longer be defended. This is the story of how a cluster of mud huts became the most powerful civilization the ancient world had ever seen, and how that same civilization, weighed down by its own size, its own politics, and its own ambitions, eventually broke apart. It is a story of kings overthrown and a republic born from rebellion. It is a story of generals who became gods and brothers who killed each other for a throne. It is a story of roads that connected continents, laws that shaped modern justice, and armies that conquered in the name of an idea bigger than any one man. But it is also a story of plague, of economic collapse, of emperors murdered by their own bodyguards, and of barbarian kings who once knelt before Rome and later ruled its ruins. Why did Rome rise when so many ancient powers failed to expand beyond their borders? Why did it endure for so long when civil war, assassination, and invasion repeatedly threatened to tear it apart? And most importantly, why did it fall, not in one cataclysmic moment, but through a slow and painful unraveling that took centuries to complete? To understand the fall of Rome, we must first understand its rise. We must go back to a time before emperors, before legions, before even the Republic itself, to a small settlement on 7 hills, where a story begins with 2 abandoned brothers, a wolf, and a river. Long before Rome ruled an empire spanning 3 continents, it was nothing more than a scattering of villages perched on hills above the Tiber River, in a region of central Italy known as Latium. The land was fertile, watered by the river, and positioned at a natural crossing point between the Etruscan civilization to the north and the Greek colonies to the south. According to Roman tradition, the city was founded in 753 BC, though archaeological evidence suggests that the hills overlooking the Tiber were inhabited by various small communities for centuries before that date. These early settlements were not yet a unified city. They were separate huts and farmsteads belonging to Latin-speaking peoples who shared a language and certain customs, but had not yet merged into a single political entity. The famous legend of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers said to be the sons of the god Mars and a Vestal priestess, abandoned at birth and suckled by a she-wolf before being raised by a shepherd, was a story told by Romans themselves centuries later to explain their origins. According to this tradition, Romulus killed his brother Remus in a dispute over where to build their city and became its first king, giving Rome its name. Whether or not the details of this myth reflect any historical reality, what is clear from archaeology is that during the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the scattered settlements on the Palatine, Capitoline, and other hills gradually consolidated into a single urban center. Rome in its earliest period was ruled by kings, a system borrowed in part from neighboring peoples, particularly the Etruscans, who at that time were the dominant civilization in central Italy and far more advanced in art, engineering, and urban planning than the early Romans. The Etruscans contributed significantly to early Roman culture, including aspects of religion, the alphabet, and certain political and military institutions. Roman tradition records 7 kings ruling the city in succession, beginning with Romulus and ending with Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, known as Tarquin the Proud, whose tyrannical rule provoked a rebellion among the Roman aristocracy. Around 509 BC, according to traditional Roman chronology, the monarchy was overthrown and the kings were replaced by a new system of government, the Republic. This transition marked one of the most consequential political developments in ancient history. Power was no longer concentrated in a single hereditary ruler, but distributed among elected magistrates, with 2 consuls serving as the chief executives, holding office for only 1 year and acting as checks upon one another. Alongside the consuls stood the Senate, a body composed primarily of the patrician aristocracy, wealthy landowning families who had long held social and political dominance in Roman society. The early republic was marked by intense internal struggle between the patricians, who controlled most political offices and religious institutions, and the plebeians, the common citizens who made up the majority of the population but were largely excluded from power. This struggle, known to historians as the conflict of the orders, unfolded over roughly 2 centuries and resulted in significant political reforms. The plebeians organized themselves, at times withdrawing en masse from the city in a tactic known as secession, refusing to serve in the army or participate in civic life until their demands were met. Through this pressure, they won the right to elect their own representatives, the tribunes of the plebs, who held the power to veto actions of the Senate and magistrates that harmed plebeian interests. Eventually, plebeians gained the right to hold consulships and other high offices, and Roman law itself was codified in the 12 tables around 450 BC, an early attempt to make justice more transparent and less arbitrary by writing down legal principles that applied to all citizens. While Rome was consolidating its internal political structure, it was also expanding its control over the Italian peninsula. This was not the result of a single grand strategy, but rather a series of conflicts, alliances, and annexations stretched across centuries. Rome fought wars against neighboring Latin tribes, against the Etruscans to the north, against the Samnites in the mountainous regions of central Italy, and eventually against the Greek colonies of southern Italy, known collectively as Magna Graecia. One of the most dramatic episodes of this period was the Gallic invasion of 390 BC, when a force of Gauls from northern Italy defeated the Roman army and sacked the city itself, an event so traumatic that it remained etched in the Roman collective memory for centuries afterward as a symbol of vulnerability and a warning against complacency. Yet Rome recovered, rebuilt its defenses, and continued its steady expansion. By the early 3rd century BC, after a series of hard-fought wars including conflicts with the Samnite Confederation and the Greek city of Tarentum, which brought in the famous Greek general Pyrrhus of Epirus to aid the southern Italians, Rome had become the dominant power on the Italian peninsula. Roman success in these wars was due in part to a distinctive approach to conquest. Rather than simply destroying or enslaving defeated enemies, Rome frequently incorporated them into a complex system of alliances, granting various forms of citizenship or allied status that bound former enemies into the Roman military and political system. Defeated peoples were often required to supply troops to the Roman army, which dramatically increased the manpower available to Rome compared to other ancient states. This system of alliance and incorporation, rather than outright domination, allowed Rome to mobilize enormous armies relative to its population, a critical factor in its subsequent rise to a Mediterranean superpower. With Italy unified under Roman leadership, Rome's ambitions inevitably turned outward toward the wider Mediterranean world. The most significant rival to emerge was Carthage, a powerful trading city on the coast of North Africa, in modern Tunisia, which controlled extensive territories in North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and parts of Spain, and possessed a navy far superior to anything Rome had yet built. The conflict between these two powers, known as the Punic Wars, would shape the future of the Mediterranean for over a century. The First Punic War, beginning in 264 BC, arose from competing interests in Sicily and forced Rome, a land power with little naval tradition, to rapidly construct a fleet capable of challenging Carthaginian dominance at sea. Roman engineers reportedly studied a captured Carthaginian ship to learn its construction, and through innovations such as the corvus, a boarding device that allowed Roman soldiers to fight as they would on land, even while at sea, Rome managed to win a series of naval victories. The war ended in 241 BC with a Roman victory, forcing Carthage to cede Sicily and pay a substantial indemnity. This first conflict, however, was merely a prelude to a far more dangerous war. The Second Punic War, beginning in 218 BC, brought one of history's most celebrated military commanders to the forefront. Hannibal Barca, son of the Carthaginian general who had fought in the First War. Hannibal executed one of the most audacious military campaigns in ancient history, leading an army that included war elephants across the Alps into Italy itself, catching Rome completely by surprise. He won a series of devastating victories against Roman armies, most notably at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, where he annihilated a Roman force of unprecedented size through brilliant tactical maneuvering, encircling and destroying the legions in one of the costliest defeats in Roman military history. Despite these catastrophic losses, Rome refused to surrender, adopting a strategy of attrition under the general Quintus Fabius Maximus, avoiding direct confrontation with Hannibal while slowly rebuilding Roman strength and isolating Carthaginian allies in Italy. Eventually, Rome carried the war to North Africa itself, and the general Scipio Africanus decisively defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, forcing Carthage to accept a humiliating peace that stripped it of its overseas territories and severely limited its military capacity. The Third Punic War, fought decades later between 149 and 146 BC, ended with the complete destruction of Carthage itself, its population killed or enslaved, and its territory annexed as a Roman province, eliminating Rome's greatest rival once and for all. With Carthage defeated, Rome turned its attention eastward toward the Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged from the fragmented empire of Alexander the Great centuries earlier. Through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic manipulation, and the steady absorption of allied states, Rome extended its influence over Macedonia, Greece, and eventually into Asia Minor and the Near East. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome had transformed from an Italian regional power into the dominant force across the entire Mediterranean basin, controlling territories on 3 continents. Yet this rapid expansion brought with it profound internal pressures that the Republic's political institutions, designed centuries earlier for a much smaller city-state, struggled to manage. Enormous wealth flowed into Rome from conquered provinces, concentrating in the hands of the senatorial aristocracy and a new class of wealthy merchants and tax collectors known as the equites. Meanwhile, small farmers, many of whom had spent years away from their lands serving in the legions, found themselves unable to compete with large slave work estates, known as latifundia, that emerged across Italy using the enormous influx of slaves captured during foreign wars. Displaced farmers flooded into Rome itself, creating a large, often impoverished urban population dependent on cheap grain and political patronage. This growing inequality and social tension set the stage for a series of political crises that would ultimately destroy the Republic from within, a process that began with the reforms proposed by two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, in the late 2nd century BC. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune in 133 BC, proposed redistributing public land to landless citizens, directly threatening the interests of wealthy landowners in the Senate. His reforms provoked such intense opposition that a group of senators and their followers murdered him in the streets of Rome. The first time in centuries that political violence had been used to resolve a domestic dispute in the city. His brother Gaius, attempting similar reforms a decade later, met a similar fate. These assassinations shattered a long-standing taboo against political violence in Roman public life and inaugurated a century of escalating conflict that would eventually consume the Republic itself as ambitious generals and politicians increasingly turned to force, rather than law and tradition, to achieve their aims. This breakdown of political norms, combined with the immense wealth and power flowing from Rome's overseas conquests, created the conditions for the rise of military strongmen who would eventually transform the Republic into something entirely new. The 1st century BC was a period of extraordinary turbulence in Roman history, as the political structures that had governed the city for over 400 years buckled under the weight of empire, inequality, and personal ambition. The breakdown of political norms that began with the murders of the Gracchus brothers accelerated dramatically with the rise of Gaius Marius, a general of relatively humble origins who rose to unprecedented prominence through a series of military victories, including a decisive campaign against an invasion by Germanic tribes that threatened northern Italy. Marius reformed the Roman army in ways that would have lasting consequences, opening recruitment to landless citizens who had previously been excluded from military service due to property requirements, and in doing so created a new dynamic in which soldiers depended on their commanding generals, rather than the state itself, for land grants and rewards after their service ended. This shift bound the loyalty of Roman soldiers increasingly to individual commanders rather than to the Republic as an abstract institution, a development that would prove catastrophic for the stability of the constitutional order. Marius's rivalry with another ambitious general, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, erupted into open civil war, and in 88 BC, Sulla became the first Roman general to march his own army against the city of Rome itself, a previously unthinkable act that shattered the long-standing prohibition against bringing troops within the sacred boundary of the city. After a period of conflict and shifting fortunes between the two men and their respective factions, Sulla emerged victorious and had himself appointed dictator, a position that under the traditional constitution was meant to be temporary and limited to extreme emergencies, but which Sulla used to conduct brutal purges of his political enemies, publishing lists of proscribed citizens who could be killed with impunity and their property confiscated. Although Sulla eventually retired from power and the Republic nominally continued, the precedent he set, that military force could be used to seize control of the state and eliminate political opponents, could not be undone. In the decades that followed, a series of powerful individuals competed for dominance within a political system increasingly incapable of containing their ambitions. Pompey the Great achieved extraordinary military success, clearing the Mediterranean of pirates and conquering vast territories in the eastern Mediterranean, while Marcus Licinius Crassus, reputedly the wealthiest man in Rome, suppressed the slave rebellion led by Spartacus and sought military glory of his own. Into this volatile environment rose Gaius Julius Caesar, a patrician with significant political talent, immense personal ambition, and a flair for connecting with the common people of Rome. Caesar formed an informal political alliance with Pompey and Crassus, known to historians as the First Triumvirate, which allowed the three men to dominate Roman politics through their combined wealth, military power, and popular support, effectively sidelining the Senate's traditional authority. Caesar used his position to secure command of Roman forces in Gaul, where over the course of roughly 8 years, from 58 to 50 BC, he conducted a series of brutal military campaigns that brought the entirety of modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Britain under Roman control. His conquest of Gaul was extraordinarily violent, resulting in the deaths or enslavement of hundreds of thousands of Gallic people, but also brought Caesar immense wealth, a battle-hardened and personally loyal army, and a reputation as one of the greatest military commanders in Roman history, all of which made him a serious threat to the established order in Rome. As tensions grew between Caesar and the Senate, which increasingly aligned itself with Pompey following the death of Crassus, the Senate eventually ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, fully aware that doing so would leave him vulnerable to prosecution by his political enemies. In 49 BC, Caesar made the fateful decision to lead his legions across the Rubicon River, the boundary that legally separated his provincial command from Italy itself, an act of open rebellion against the Roman state. This decision plunged Rome into a civil war that would last for years, fought across Italy, Greece, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain. Caesar's military genius and the loyalty of his veteran legions allowed him to defeat Pompey's forces decisively at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, after which Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was assassinated upon arrival, depriving Caesar of a final confrontation, but leaving him as the unrivaled master of the Roman world. Caesar returned to Rome and was granted a series of extraordinary honors and powers, eventually being declared dictator for life in 44 BC, a title that confirmed for many senators their worst fears that the Republic had effectively ended and that Caesar intended to rule as an autocrat. This fear drove a conspiracy of senators, including men who had once been Caesar's allies, to assassinate him on the Ides of March, the 15th day of March, 44 BC, stabbing him to death in a meeting of the Senate, believing that his death would restore the traditional republic. Instead, Caesar's assassination plunged Rome into yet another round of civil conflict, as his adopted heir, the young Gaius Octavius, later known as Octavian, allied initially with Caesar's loyal lieutenant Mark Antony and a third figure, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate to hunt down and eliminate Caesar's assassins and consolidate control over the Roman state. The alliance between Octavian and Antony, however, was inherently unstable, and as the years passed, their interests diverged sharply, particularly as Antony became romantically and politically entangled with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, whose immense wealth and resources made the partnership appear as a serious threat to Rome's traditional power structure. Octavian skillfully portrayed the conflict as a struggle between Roman values and a foreign queen who sought to corrupt and dominate Rome through Antony, rallying public and senatorial support behind his cause. The decisive confrontation came at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC, off the coast of Greece, where Octavian's forces, commanded by his brilliant general Marcus Agrippa, decisively defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. Both Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where they ultimately took their own lives rather than face capture, leaving Octavian as the sole and unchallenged master of the entire Roman world. Rather than declaring himself king or dictator, titles that carry deeply negative associations in Roman political culture due to the city's founding rejection of monarchy and the fate of Julius Caesar, Octavian carefully constructed a new political settlement that preserved the outward appearances and institutions of the Republic while concentrating real power firmly in his own hands. In 27 BC, he accepted the title Augustus from the Senate, a term with strong religious and moral connotations suggesting reverence and majesty, And through a careful combination of constitutional offices, military command, and immense personal wealth, he established what historians now call the Roman Empire, even though Augustus himself preferred to be known simply as princeps, the first citizen, rather than emperor. Augustus's reign, lasting until his death in AD 14, ushered in an extended period of relative peace and stability known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which would continue with intermittent disruptions for roughly 2 centuries. During this period, the Roman Empire reached its greatest extent and prosperity, with secure borders allowing for unprecedented levels of trade, urban development, and cultural exchange across a territory that eventually stretched from the highlands of Scotland to the deserts of Mesopotamia and from the Rhine and Danube rivers to the Sahara Desert. Augustus reorganized the administration of the provinces, established a standing professional army with fixed terms of service and retirement benefits, created a police and firefighting force for the city of Rome, and undertook extensive building programs that transformed the city from a relatively modest urban center into a magnificent capital befitting a world empire. Famously claiming that he found Rome built of brick and left it built of marble. The succeeding emperors of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, including Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, varied enormously in their competence and character, ranging from capable administrators to figures remembered for cruelty, instability, and excess. Yet the underlying structures of imperial governance that Augustus had established proved remarkably resilient, surviving even periods of poor leadership and renewed civil conflict, such as the chaotic year of the 4 emperors in AD 69, following Nero's death. The empire was subsequently stabilized under the Flavian dynasty, and then experienced what many historians consider its golden age under the 5 good emperors, a sequence of capable rulers including Trajan, under whom the empire reached its maximum territorial extent, and Hadrian, who consolidated and fortified the empire's borders rather than pursuing further expansion, recognizing the practical limits of Roman military and administrative capacity. This period saw the construction of monumental infrastructure projects across the empire, an extensive network of roads connecting distant provinces to facilitate trade and military movement, aqueducts supplying fresh water to cities, and a relatively unified legal and administrative system that, despite significant regional variation and inequality, brought a degree of stability and economic integration to a vast and diverse territory unlike anything the ancient Mediterranean world had previously experienced. The stability that characterized the Roman Empire during its height could not last indefinitely, and beginning in the 3rd century AD, the empire entered a period of profound and sustained crisis that nearly brought about its complete collapse more than 200 years before its eventual fall in the West. This period, often referred to by historians as the crisis of the 3rd century, was marked by a convergence of military, economic, political, and social pressures that exposed the underlying fragility of an empire that had grown too large and too complex to be governed effectively by the institutions originally designed for a much smaller state. The immediate trigger for the crisis is often traced to the assassination of the Emperor Severus Alexander in AD 235, which inaugurated nearly 50 years of extraordinary political instability, during which more than 20 different men claimed or held the imperial throne, the vast majority of whom were killed by their own soldiers, rival claimants, or assassins within a remarkably short period of holding power. This rapid turnover of emperors reflected a fundamental shift in the nature of imperial authority. Increasingly, the legitimacy of an emperor depended not on Senate approval or hereditary succession, but on the loyalty and support of the army, particularly the legions stationed along the empire's frontiers, who frequently elevated their own commanding generals to the purple in exchange for promises of pay and plunder, only to abandon or murder them when a more promising candidate emerged or when military setbacks undermined confidence in their leadership. This destructive cycle of usurpation and assassination severely weakened the empire's capacity to respond effectively to external threats at precisely the moment when those threats were intensifying dramatically. Along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, Rome faced increasing pressure from a shifting array of Germanic peoples, including the Alemanni, the Franks, and the Goths, who launched repeated incursions into Roman territory, sometimes penetrating deep into the empire's interior provinces. Simultaneously, in the east, Rome faced a renewed and far more dangerous adversary in the form of the Sassanid Persian Empire, which had overthrown the previous Parthian dynasty and pursued a far more aggressive and centralized military policy against Roman territories in Mesopotamia and Syria. In one of the most humiliating episodes in Roman military history, the Emperor Valerian was defeated and captured by the Sassanid king Shapur I in AD 260, reportedly spending the remainder of his life in captivity, an event that shocked the Roman world and starkly illustrated the empire's vulnerability. The combined pressure of internal political chaos and external military threats nearly caused the empire to fragment entirely during this period. In the West, a breakaway state known as the Gallic Empire emerged, encompassing Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain, governed independently of the central Roman administration for over a decade. In the East, the Palmyrene Empire, centered on the wealthy trading city of Palmyra in Syria and led by the formidable Queen Zenobia, similarly broke away from central Roman control, seizing Egypt and substantial portions of Roman territory in the eastern Mediterranean. The fact that the Roman Empire could fragment into three competing states and yet eventually be reunified stands as a testament both to the severity of the crisis and to the underlying resilience of Roman administrative and military institutions, as well as to the capabilities of a series of soldier emperors who emerged from the ranks of the army itself, rather than the traditional aristocracy, to gradually restore order. Among these figures, the Emperor Aurelian, who reigned from AD 270 to 275, proved particularly effective, successfully defeating the Palmyrene Empire and reincorporating the Gallic Empire into Roman control through a combination of military skill and diplomatic flexibility, earning him the title Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. Aurelian also recognized the empire's vulnerability by constructing massive new defensive walls around the city of Rome itself. The first such fortifications the city had required in centuries, a symbolic acknowledgement that the era of unquestioned Roman security had ended. The process of stabilization continued and accelerated under the Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in AD 284 and implemented a series of sweeping reforms intended to address the structural weaknesses that had caused the crisis. Recognizing that the empire had grown too large and complex for a single ruler to govern and defend effectively, Diocletian established a system of shared imperial rule known as the Tetrarchy, dividing administrative and military responsibility among four co-rulers, two senior emperors holding the title Augustus and two junior emperors holding the title Caesar, each responsible for different regions of the empire. While this particular arrangement did not survive intact for long after Diocletian's retirement, the broader principle of dividing administrative responsibility between an eastern and western half of the empire would persist and deepen in subsequent decades, eventually evolving into a more permanent division between the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, the latter of which would eventually become known to history as the Byzantine Empire. Diocletian also implemented extensive economic reforms, attempting to combat the severe inflation that had plagued the empire throughout the crisis period due to the debasement of Roman currency by successive emperors desperate to fund their military expenses, and he reorganized provincial administration, increasing the number of provinces while reducing their individual size. In order to limit the ability of any single provincial governor to accumulate enough military and political power to challenge central authority. Perhaps most significantly for the long-term religious and cultural trajectory of the empire, Diocletian also initiated one of the most severe and systematic persecutions of Christians in Roman history, attempting to enforce traditional Roman religious practices and eliminate what he and other officials viewed as a dangerous and subversive religious movement that refused to honor the traditional gods upon whom the safety and prosperity of the Roman state were believed to depend. This persecution, however, ultimately failed to suppress Christianity, which had already spread extensively throughout the empire among all social classes, and within a generation, the religious landscape of Rome would undergo a transformation more profound than even Diocletian could have imagined. Following a complex period of renewed civil war after Diocletian's retirement, the Emperor Constantine emerged victorious, famously attributing a decisive military victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in AD 312 to the intervention of the Christian god, after which he became the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity and to actively support and promote the previously persecuted faith. Constantine's reign marked a turning point of immense historical significance, as Christianity transitioned from a marginalized and periodically persecuted minority religion into a favored and increasingly dominant force within Roman society, culture, and eventually governance. A transformation that would have lasting consequences for the development of European civilization long after the political structures of the Roman Empire itself had disappeared. Constantine also founded a new imperial capital on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, strategically located at the crossing point between Europe and Asia, which he named Constantinople in his own honor. A city that would eventually become the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire and would endure as a center of Christian civilization for over 1,000 years after the western half of the empire had ceased to exist. Despite these reforms and the temporary stabilization they achieved, the underlying pressures that had caused the crisis of the 3rd century did not disappear entirely. The empire's frontiers remained under constant pressure from various Germanic peoples. The cost of maintaining the army and the increasingly elaborate imperial bureaucracy continued to strain the empire's economic resources. And the division of administrative responsibility between eastern and western halves of the empire, while pragmatically necessary, also created divergent interests and capacities between the two regions, with the wealthier and more urbanized eastern provinces generally proving more resilient than the western provinces in the centuries that followed. These accumulated pressures would set the stage for the final and most consequential crisis the western half of the Roman Empire would ever face. A crisis triggered not by internal political collapse alone, but by a dramatic and unprecedented movement of peoples across the empire's frontiers that would ultimately prove impossible to contain. The final collapse of the Western Roman Empire did not occur as a single dramatic event, but unfolded over the course of roughly a century, driven by a complex combination of mass migrations, military defeats, economic decline, and political fragmentation that gradually stripped the Western emperors of the territory, resources, and authority needed to govern effectively. The chain of events that set this final crisis in motion began far from Roman territory itself, on the steppes of Central Asia, where the Huns, a nomadic and highly mobile warrior people, began expanding westward during the late 4th century, displacing and terrifying the various Germanic peoples who lived along the eastern frontiers of the Roman Empire. Among these displaced groups were the Goths, who in AD 376 appealed to the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens for permission to cross the Danube River and settle within Roman territory, seeking refuge from the Huns. Valens granted this request, hoping to use the Goths as a source of military manpower and agricultural labor. But the settlement process was managed with such corruption, mistreatment, and incompetence by local Roman officials that the Goths soon rose in open rebellion against Roman authority. This rebellion culminated in one of the most disastrous military defeats in Roman history, the Battle of Adrianople in AD 378, in which a Roman army was decisively destroyed and the Emperor Valens himself was killed on the battlefield. A catastrophe that demonstrated with brutal clarity that the balance of military power along the empire's frontiers had shifted in ways that posed an existential threat to Roman control. Although the Eastern Roman Empire managed to reach a negotiated settlement with the Goths, allowing them to settle within imperial territory as a semi-autonomous group, the precedent of large, organized barbarian populations residing within the empire's borders while maintaining their own distinct military and political identity proved to be a profoundly destabilizing development. The pressure from the Huns continued to displace other Germanic peoples toward Roman territory in the following decades, and the situation grew dramatically more severe at the very end of AD 406, when the Rhine frontier, the long-standing boundary that had separated Roman Gaul from Germanic territories for centuries, was breached by a massive coalition of Vandals, Suebi, and Alans, who crossed into Roman Gaul largely unopposed due to the chaotic state of Roman frontier defenses at the time. This breach proved impossible for the Western Roman Empire to fully reverse, and these various peoples gradually moved through Gaul and eventually into Spain, carving out their own territories within what had formerly been secure Roman provinces. The Western Roman Empire during this period was increasingly governed not by strong emperors in their own right, but by powerful military commanders, often themselves of partial barbarian origin, who controlled the imperial government while emperors served largely as figureheads. One such commander, the Vandal-descended General Stilicho, attempted to manage the empire's deteriorating military situation during the early 5th century, but his execution in AD 408 on suspicion of treason removed one of the few remaining figures capable of coordinating an effective response to the mounting crisis. In AD 410, a Visigothic army led by King Alaric, after years of complex and often frustrated negotiations with the Roman government over payment, land, and status for his people, marched on the city of Rome itself and sacked it, an event of extraordinary symbolic significance that sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. Although the city had ceased to be the actual administrative capital of the Western Empire by this time, with emperors typically residing in more strategically defensible cities such as Ravenna, the sack of Rome nonetheless represented the first time the city had fallen to a foreign enemy in roughly 800 years, profoundly shaking confidence in the permanence and invincibility of Roman power. The decades that followed saw the continued fragmentation of Western Roman territory, as various Germanic groups established increasingly permanent and autonomous kingdoms within what had formerly been Roman provinces, including Visigothic territories in Spain and southern Gaul, Vandal territories that eventually extended into North Africa, and Frankish territories in northern Gaul. The Western Roman government, increasingly impoverished by the loss of tax revenue from these lost provinces, found itself caught in a vicious cycle in which declining resources made it progressively more difficult to maintain the military forces necessary to defend remaining territories, which in turn led to further territorial losses and further declining revenue. A brief but significant unifying threat emerged in the mid-5th century in the form of Attila, the formidable king of the Huns, who launched devastating invasions into both the Eastern and Western Roman empires, demanding enormous tribute payments and at one point advancing as far as Gaul itself, where a combined Roman and Gothic force under the general Aetius managed to halt his advance at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in AD 451, one of the last instances of effective large-scale Roman military cooperation with former barbarian adversaries against a common threat. Attila's subsequent death in AD 453 led to the rapid collapse of the Hunnic Confederation, removing one significant external threat. But by this point, the Western Roman Empire had already lost effective control over most of its former territories outside of Italy itself. And even within Italy, real political and military power increasingly rested in the hands of barbarian generals who commanded the loyalty of the remaining Roman and allied barbarian troops. The final decades of the Western Roman Empire were marked by an almost absurd succession of short-lived and largely powerless emperors, frequently installed and removed at the whim of powerful military strongmen, most of whom were themselves of Germanic origin and held the real military power within Italy. The historical conclusion of the Western Roman Empire is traditionally dated to AD 476, when Odoacer, a Germanic military leader serving as commander of the remaining Roman army in Italy, deposed the young Emperor Romulus Augustulus, whose very name, ironically echoing both the legendary founder of Rome and the first Emperor Augustus, seemed to symbolically bookend the empire's history. Rather than installing another puppet emperor, Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and ruled Italy in his own right as a king, formally acknowledging the authority of the Eastern Roman Emperor while effectively ending the line of Western Roman emperors that had begun with Augustus exactly 5 centuries earlier. It is important to recognize that this event, while traditionally regarded as the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire, did not represent a sudden or singular catastrophe, but rather the final formal acknowledgement of a long process of territorial loss, military decline, and institutional fragmentation that had been unfolding for decades, if not generations. Roman administrative structures, landholding patterns, religious institutions, and cultural traditions did not vanish overnight, but persisted in modified forms throughout the successor kingdoms that emerged across the former territories of the Western Empire, gradually blending with Germanic customs and institutions to form the foundations of medieval European civilization. The Eastern Roman Empire, by contrast, survived this period of crisis largely intact, retaining control of its wealthier and more urbanized territories in the Eastern Mediterranean, and continued to exist, evolving culturally and linguistically into what historians term the Byzantine Empire for nearly another 1,000 years, until the city of Constantinople itself finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The reasons historians cite for the fall of the Western Roman Empire are numerous and remain subjects of ongoing scholarly debate, including the sheer scale and persistence of barbarian migrations across the frontiers, the chronic political instability, and frequent civil wars that diverted military resources away for frontier defense. The increasing economic burden of maintaining a vast military and bureaucratic apparatus on a tax base that was steadily eroded by territorial losses, and the gradual loss of the deep civic and military traditions that had once bound Roman citizens and soldiers to the defense of the state itself. Whatever the precise balance of causes, the legacy of Rome, in its laws, its languages, its architecture, its religious transformations, and its political concepts proved far more enduring than the empire's political structures themselves, shaping the subsequent development of European and indeed world civilization in ways that continue to resonate many centuries after the last Western Roman emperor was quietly deposed in a small Italian city.